So I'm going to start laying down a flat color. And the key to doing a flat color is multiple brush strokes. And then we're going to let it, a lot of times let it dry. And then we're going to go over it a second and third time. And that's going to allow the color to become more saturated. It's going to build up. Now I'm going to do that same thing for the next square, for the glossy square. One of the bonus techniques is graffito. I'm going to jump to the mix on canvas or mix on paper, and I've got red on my brush. I'm going to put some red down, and then I'm going to grab some white, and I'm actually just going to mix on the paper. Back and forth, little X's. I've got a little bit of blue on my brush, so it's going to turn into this red-violet tint. The more I play with it, I can make this really interesting mauve color. But I'm going to let the colors mix on the canvas rather than mixing them on my palette. And this is going to make an optical color that can be really interesting. The more you stir it, the one color is going to melt into the color beneath. And so you want to pay attention to, do you want it to be smooth like I've got here? Do I want it to be smoother? The more I work the color, the smoother it'll get. And then I think I want mine to be a little bit splotchy, so I'm going to go back in here with some red and give it a little more life. Okay, so that's mix on the canvas. That's a super easy one. Okay, so I've got this pink rolling. I'm going to mix up a pink, so it's just nice and flat. Instead of mixing it on the canvas, I'll mix it just to give it a little variety. And then I'm going to paint my rubber cement square with a flat color. And I'm going to paint my tape resist with a flat color. This is kind of like the underpainting that we talk about early on. And I'm going to paint my stencil a flat color, or relatively flat. I'm going to rinse my brush since I switched colors, and I'm going to go back to my first square. My first flat square should be relatively dry now. Dry it with some paper towel. Now I'm going to go back to my original color, and I'm going to change directions. I'm just going to rotate my canvas. And I went side to side, and now I'm going to go top to bottom, or bottom to top. Every time you layer another coat, it's going to saturate that area of your painting, and it's going to become more intense. And sometimes like 4 or 5 layers of color can take cheap paints. Our paints are not super cheap, but they're not like $10 an ounce either. Sometimes by layering you can get a brighter, deeper color just by putting another coat over the top. Okay, so double loaded brush is super easy. I'm going to take and I'm going to dip my brush halfway into the blue, and then I'll use yellow. Use whatever you want. So you kind of see how I've got blue and yellow on my brush. This is sort of a careful thing, but now I can take and I can pull the paint across the canvas, or I can wiggle it, and you can sometimes get some interesting effects with that. For a triple loaded brush, I'm going to do the same thing, only I'm going to paint. This is like super tedious, but I'm going to paint my brush. with some different colors. So if you can see, there's red in the middle, there's yellow, and then there's blue. So you can just get as crazy with this kind of stuff as you want. You can go 5 colors. But I'm going to pull, and then I'll change directions. And I'll pull again. And then I'm going to flip my brush to the other side. And I'm going to pull. Pull again. And then the tough part with this technique is you have to reload your brush. If you're willing to put this time in, you can get some really beautiful results. And a wash is really, you take whatever your solvent is and you can mix your paint so that it's like a puddle. And a wash can be really interesting. I'm going to do a little drawing just to show you how this can be an advantage. If you have an area of a painting that you painted and maybe it's jumping out too much, I can take a wash and I can float this over the top and it's going to push it back. I've got to wait though because that's wet, so I'll come back to that one. If we jump down to pull and flip, switch up to your liner brush. Remember, that's the one that's got more of a point to it. For that one, I'm going to actually lay the brush down and then pull a little bit. Now that's going to take the paint out of the one side. It's going to shape the brush, and then it's going to push the paint into the top. So now I can flip the brush again. I can lay the brush down onto the canvas, and I can pull it. And that's actually a really powerful technique. I'm going to do it again, but this time I'm going to go at an angle. So I can lay the brush down, and then I can pull it at a different angle. And that's going to give you a different mark. I'm going to flip my brush the other side. I'm going to lay the brush down and I'm going to pull at an angle. And so you can start to like shape reflections in windows. You can shape ripples in water. You can do leaves on trees just by using the shape of the brush. Pull and flip kind of works with shaders too. I'll go over here. So I can set down and I can pull and I can get like a really nice bold line. Then I can flip it and I can pull and I can get a certain kind of line. A lot of times an artist, if they like this second line, they'll actually remove the excess paint on their palette or an extra piece of paper, and then when it's the right amount of paint, they'll go back and they'll do that perfect brush stroke on their canvas. Okay, so pay attention to how the shape of your brush. There's fan brushes, there's filberts. This is a filbert right here. It's kind of rounded. It's in between a liner, and so a filbert is going to give you its own shape. Okay, so I think this area that I want to show the wash on is ready. So I'll go back now. And I've got this water thinning down my acrylic. You would use turpentine or similar. So I'm going to paint with that. And it's going to be almost like watercolor. It's going to push back the yellow. It's going to give that area some unity. A wash is really interesting because if you get it where you don't want, you can kind of pick it up with a rag or a paper towel. It's not going to go away 100% on this paper, but it'll definitely go back so I can do something else that I want to. Another thing that's really fun is I'm going to take clean water and I'm just going to paint and wet the canvas or wet the paper in this case. So I'm going to get that area a little saturated with water. And for this one I'm going to use my liner brush and I'm going to make a wet paint but not a wash. So I'm going to water down some paint here, a little water on my brush, a little paint, and you can get this while the paper's wet. You can get this really soft line. Because it's going to dissolve into the paper because the water is helping break up the edge. Some artists get a little bit more water in there. This starts to get into some watercolor techniques, but you can let this thing kind of drift and flow around a little bit too. I don't know if you can kind of see how soft that color is floating in there. I'm going to pick up some of this polymedium and I'm going to find my glossy square and I'm going to paint it. And this is going to be like a clear nail polish, or a clear coat on a car. I want to paint it and I want it to go thin so it's not milky. If it's milky, those air bubbles will actually make it not shiny. It can make it muddy. But if you keep pulling until it's even, then I'm going to let this dry for a second. And then I'm going to go over another direction. And then like 3 coats, 3 thin coats that dry can really get you a nice glossy surface. I'm going to make a glaze out of this. I'm going to take some blue and I'm going to mix it with polymedium, like 50-50. And then this is going to be in between a wash and so I can add a color. And it's like frosting or icing or dye. So you can glaze stuff too. And this is a little bit thicker and it'll dry kind of shiny. So the more medium you put in, this is very similar to the wash, but the color is going to be more bold. So take a minute, let it dry in between, and then try a glaze and try glossy. I've got to do the Google Meet really quick.
To painting the figure.
I'm going to jump back over to Sgraffito now, for those of you who are doing the different brush techniques. I'm going to pick up a contrasting color, in this case white, and I'm going to paint a coat of white over the top of this blue.
That has life model sessions.
This is kind of a time-sensitive one.
Completely unique set of skills. It forces you to see it differently. You'll have to compensate for the natural movement of the model. A human
While the paint is still wet, I'm going to use the handle of my paintbrush.
When you're not used to it. But once you understand how
and
it
I'm going to
works,
draw through.
Once you figure out how
I'm going to try to add some energy to this area.
Sway, your painting and drawing might actually look more natural because it will adapt to this natural position. Another good thing
That
about
can be
working from
a
life
really
is
fun
that
way
it
to add
forces you
pattern
to
or
stick to a
clothing
schedule
or
and work
a
intensively.
little zip to an area of
Model
your painting
time
that
is
seems
precious
stale.
time, so if you have someone that
So
is
that's called
okay to sit
Sgraffito.
for, it has to be decided
Next one I'm
before.
going to do is dry
Being a
brush.
model is pretty tough.
A lot of times
You
dry
should
brush can be really
try
fun for like
just
trees, or
standing and not moving for
a lot of times I'll grab like a piece of paper towel
Your model might
and actually
even
paint a little bit
suggest
to
you
get some of
some
the paint off.
changes and make your painting evolve.
Not too much, just a little bit.
Finally, working from life is a long process.
And then
that you
when
can
my
make
paintbrush
evolve.
starts to get
You have a lot
exhausted
of
from
time to
paint,
change things.
I can
I remember
pull,
once with a
and it's
model
going to
I
be
suggested a change in hairstyle after
like this
9
fuzzy
hours or 12
brushwork.
hours, and it worked well. With a photograph, I wouldn't have had this option.
See how it's kind of got that broken edge, that
Even if I
see-through
love
edge?
working from life,
So
I
a
use
lot of artists will
photography
use dry
for
brush.
painting very often. Several
Another
reasons.
version of
It is
dry
fast
brush.
and practical. You just
Again, I'm
take
going
a
to dry it
picture
out
and
just a little
work
bit on a
your
rag.
painting when you have time.
I'm going to stab
It
up and
doesn't
down
require asking a friend to stay still for hours or paying for
as
a
the
model, which can be
brush is
expensive.
out of paint.
And if you have
And that can
Photoshop
make like
or
really
GIMP
interesting
or
cloud
any type
textures.
of editing software, you can edit the picture and have an idea of
I can mix on the
possible
canvas
changes you might want to do with
some
the
shade.
paint.
I'm going to put
You
some
can easily
blue
preview
and
composition
dry brush that in.
or color choices.
Then I come over with some yellow, and I'll go to the other side. And you can start to sculpt like sun shining on trees or bushes or things like that. So those are a couple dry brush techniques to try.
The subject
I'm going to add a flat area of color
according
to this
these
ragging.
people, make things look more inexpressive. First of all, it is true for a
I'm gonna let that dry.
picture taken without any divvied out.
So I'm going to take a little
But
bit of this
you
modeling
need to know
paste.
how to use it
This is like
as a
frosting.
painter.
I'm going to give you all just a little clump of it on your palette. With the palette knife, they come in different shapes. This one, we got a bunch of these. They're kind of nice. This is more of a traditional. Got them in plastic or metal. And I'm going to use the traditional one. I'll mix up some color, and then it's a little bit tricky, but I can pick up the paint
on photography and painting is just
onto the palette knife. See, I've got this little roll of color. You can do just flat color, but it's really interesting with more than that.
Photography is just like a ruler or
I'm going to go over to my palette knife square, and I'm going to touch the palette knife, and then I'm going to pull it across. You can wiggle, you can go back and forth, and so you can get, obviously it's like way too big, but you can get these really interesting squeegee effects with the palette knife. I'm going to scrape the palette knife off. I can even scrape the painting off. Sometimes people paint and then they pull it back. You can scratch through. I can put it back down again. I should have told you to use the tip is more controllable. A lot of times people will pick up and they'll put the paint down with the palette knife, and they'll use that squeegee to get the color to do some really fun texture. This collage square right here, and then the glaze over collage, these two right there. So I'm going to take this little map square, and I'm going to paint from the back. A lot of times we do this on a separate piece of paper. The poly medium, yep, it's basically clear glue. Very. So I'm going to paint all the way off to the edges on this square. Start from the middle and paint to the outside. And then I'm going to bring it over, and I'm going to put it down. I'm going to kind of polish it on there with my finger. As long as I've got poly medium on my brush, I'm going to do my second coat on my glossy square. Remember, we're looking to build up several thin coats to make this seem more shiny. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do the same thing with my second. I think I gave you two little squares. Now, if you have a really challenging material, here's a bonus. I can coat my canvas with a clear coat of polymedium. I'm going to let that dry. I'll add the glue, the polymedium, to the back of my piece of paper. And then I'll go ahead and I'll polish that down. Now if you seal up the bottom coat before you paint the top coat, a lot of times it doesn't peel off. Sometimes if you don't do that, the collage peels off, which is a bummer. A lot of times you can use masking tape. And I'm going to pull the lint off of my shirt. And then I'm going to cut this into some interesting shapes, like little strips. I like to do strips. Where's it? You got to find my tape resist right here. So I'm going to put down these little strips on my tape resist spot. So I'm going to paint over the top with this red. I'm going to leave my tape on until it's drier, but not necessarily dried the whole way. Okay, so now that my collage has had a chance to dry, I'm going to go back and I'm going to mix another glaze. Since it's a blue map, I'm going to use a glaze of blue again. Maybe a little bit of white. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paint a glaze over the top of the collage to give it a tint or to push it back. The more pigment you use and the less polymedium, the more it will obscure what's going on there. So again, collage can be a really interesting way. I had a student do a portrait of her sister in drawing class, and she took her favorite sweatshirt or flannel and she put it in the copy machine and then made a Xerox of it and then glued it onto the drawing and then drew over the top. It was like a really neat approach. So there we go. We've got the unglazed collage and then we got the glazed collage. A lot of times with collage, what you do is after it's dry, 10, 15 minutes, whatever, the next day, then we take our clear and we go over the top. And that helps protect the vulnerable paper and it seals it up. Sometimes people clear coat it and then they'll go back and paint over it later. Alright, then we're going to jump back into our modeling paste. That's that glop of frosting that I gave you earlier. I'm going to cut some of this out and I'm going to work it back and forth to try to make it more creamy. Our modeling paste is getting kind of old, and so you take the dried out lumps and you get rid of them and then focus on the stuff that's still flexible. And then a lot of times you can think about modeling paste as like frosting on a cake. So you can make really thick viscous paint by adding modeling paste to it. Once I've got it mixed up, I'm going to add the color until I get a color that I'm looking for. It can be more than one color. You can leave it marbled. So then either with a palette knife or like a chiseled brush, I can pick this up. It's going to be really thick. And I can drop that down and it almost becomes like a little sculpture. I've seen people, how the sun sometimes just glows through the fog? I've seen people mix up a really thick modeling paste and then they put a little dot for the sun and then they add color and kind of sculpt it like I'm doing here. It can be a really neat effect. So if somebody was to look at this modeling paste, they'll see that it actually, see how thick it is? It like sticks up off the canvas and kind of grabs your attention. There's a good angle. So, okay, so my tape resist is probably dry now. So I'm going to go back over that with another layer just to show you that you can. Use a peach color this time. Paint that over the top. And then when those are dry, I'll peel back my tape. And there's a lot of artists who really like the hard edge that you can get from tape. Scumbling! I gotta say, I'm not the world's best scumbler, but we'll give it a shot. I'm gonna grab kind of thicker paint. You can even use your modeling paste. And I'm gonna put a couple colors down on the canvas. And I'm gonna let them mix in their glops on the canvas. I'm gonna flip the brush. I'm gonna wiggle like so. And I'm just gonna kind of drop with the brush the paint. And this little marbling and mixing and folding and layering is gonna happen. And again, in like trees, rocks, abstract spots. I don't know if you can see all the crazy stuff that's happening in this paint right there. But I always feel like if you're leaving really thick glops of paint, almost marbling it and flipping and folding onto the canvas, you have to be really careful with scumbling, but it can be really good. And I like a filbert brush or that rounded white brush for scumbling. I don't use it very much. Probably should practice more. So that's 20 techniques. That's pretty good. One of the other ones I want to show you is lining. So right here I've got this empty space. Whenever I want to make a line, a lot of times I like to use my liner brush. I like to get the brush wet and then I scoop out some paint and I make not a glaze, but I make the paint runny. I can use the tip of the brush and I can make these really delicate lines. Do another one. I can lay the brush down and pull, and I can get thicker lines. If I go less pressure, I get a medium line. If I hold it at an angle or roll the brush, I can get super thick lines. And the trick to a good liner is to get enough pigment, typically that it's not super see-through, but also enough water that it flows nicely off the brush. Another fun way to line with bigger brushes, and you'll see this in some techniques, I'm going to go back and forth with this brush. I'm going to pick up and load my brush with paint. Let's see, how about, and then what you can do with this, I'll just do this to the side here, is I can go stab, and you can get these really fine, delicate straight lines by overlapping. You see how this brush is quite a bit bigger than the other one, right? But by using that edge, you see how razor sharp a flat brush can be? So by stabbing straight up and down and sharpening it on my palette, you see how those lines are just super, super fine, and that can be really interesting for adding some color. Another technique that's kind of fun is called pointillism. And pointillism, I'll do that one right here. Basically, you're going to take complementary colors. So I'm going to do these little red dots. With my filbert, any brush really. And then a pointillist typically will mix a complement. So I'll use a green, and to give it a little contrast, I'll maybe add a little white tint of green. And now I'm going to put, I would let this dry, but I would go back in and I would put a little dot of green right next to every red. And because those are complementary, that little bit of green is going to make the red jump forward. And this was invented by George Seurat, late early 1900s. And he made some really beautiful paintings by putting complementary colors next to each other. They almost glow when you see them. Green next to the red, and it'll make the red seem more red. So we're just gonna stencil. Is super easy. Sometimes you want to add like a shape. I'm just gonna cut out a little heart. You can do whatever. Oh, love. And I'm gonna go to my stencil spot, which I painted orange earlier. I'm not sure what color you did. And the trick with stencil a lot of times is to stab it up and down. If you pull the brush across, a lot of times the paint will like squish underneath your stencil and it'll ruin the shape, although the softness can be really nice. So I'll pull the stencil away. I can move it to another spot. Usually after the first area is dry. You can get some interesting 3D effects by going with like shades of a color or tints of a color and moving the stencil around. I'm going to use my finger for this one as a stand-in for a sponge. If you have a lot of ground to cover, you can pick up a color and sort of tap your sponge so it starts to run out of paint, but it's not out all the way. And you can dab an area with the sponge. For a small square, your finger works really well. I know a lot of artists that will use a sponge to create textures in the sky or in the clouds. You can cut your sponge into different shapes. So sponging is a nice way to add some interest or texture. Very similar to sponging is ragging. I'm going to take a rag, an old cloth, paper towel. I'm going to crumple it up until I get some interesting folds. This is almost like printmaking. I'm going to go to an area where I have some flat color. In fact, I'll prepare an area. I'm going to lay this rag into the color. I'm going to go to this ragging square and I'm going to press that in. And ragging can be an interesting way to add color. So you're using like the folds of cloth and the chaos of the cloth to stencil or to put down different, but you can't have too much. You just have to have the right amount. Otherwise it looks like a hot mess. Okay, so got a couple things that I want to show you. These are a little bit more specialty things, but they're pretty neat. We've got this stuff, which is a liquid mask. It's rubber cement with a little bit of dye in it. Rubber cement is typically clear, so it's kind of hard to see. So they came up with a rubber cement that's got some pink, or sometimes it's got red or blue, depending upon the brand. So I'm going to dip my brush in there. And then in my little rubber cement square, I'm just going to do a little painting. I'll put an R for rubber cement. And then I'm going to rinse my brush right away, sometimes with warm water, because you don't want the rubber to ruin your brush. And then with warm water, I'll paint it back and forth to kind of get the stuff off of there. Then I'm going to go into it. I've got one done here, it's dry. So I'm going to grab another color. Usually a contrasting color, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to take a little bit of red, and I'm going to paint this over the top. So you kind of got to think ahead with some of this painting stuff. There's some layering that happens. And I don't know if you can see it, but the R that I painted is kind of in there, just barely. So I'm going to let that dry. While we wait for that to dry, I'm going to show you one other thing that's kind of cool. It's called gold leaf or silver leaf. We have this stuff called metal leaf size. Okay? It's a liquid. This is a pressure sensitive glue. Now, if anybody's ever seen like altar paintings, paintings of like the Virgin Mary or Jesus in the Vatican or in Mrs. Crochel's class, World History or something like that, Mr. Munson, a lot of times they would use gold to show that people were important. Sometimes like the emperor would have gold or a religious figure would have gold. So we're going to show you how we do that today. In the old days, they would paint clay and do all sorts of crazy things. Nowadays, we just buy this little bottle of pressure-sensitive glue. I'm going to put a really thin coat down on my gold leaf square. And I'm going to do another one on my silver leaf square here. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to paint usually 2 thin coats or 3 thin coats are better than 1 thick coat. So those are both dry. Just use a hair dryer. A lot of times this is a nice technique. So I'm going to get in there with like an eraser from your pencil. You can use your finger. And on this rubber cement spot, I'm going to do little circles. And you see how that rubber cement, that liquid mask, it's actually going to peel up. It's going to be this little rubber band kind of thing. And so you can get some really cool, sometimes it's hard to tape exactly what you want, and so by painting with liquid, you can get like a softer, more painterly effect. So that's the rubber cement one. Now this gold leaf is dry, but it's still tacky. So it's like a pressure sensitive glue. So I'm gonna do a second coat of gold leaf. Usually it takes 2 coats. So you saw the first one. Now I'm gonna put the second one down. Not too thick, but not too thin. Just a nice little glaze of glue. Again, I want to rinse my brush with warm water so that it doesn't dry and ruin my brush. So I shouldn't have rushed that a little bit too much. You see this little drip? That's kind of a bummer because that's going to be there now. It's hard to get that stuff off. Maybe I could scrape it with a razor blade. Now we have gold leaf, silver leaf, copper leaf. Here's some silver. Some copper should be in there somewhere too. So I'll show you gold leaf first. So this is real gold. It's pounded out to like 1 molecule thick. So you have these little sheets. And so I'm going to flip through until I find a sheet that hasn't been used yet or has only been partially used. There's one. And a lot of people handle this with a clean paintbrush. So I can take this little square and I can slide it over onto where I want it to go. And then I'm just going to paint it on with a paintbrush. And you can kind of tear it away. Now, in a lot of culture, gold is really special. It's reserved for special occasions. It's a rare metal. It catches light really beautifully. And so if you want to make people pay attention to a part of your painting, you can add some gold to it. Now again, I'm working kind of fast. You would let this sit a little bit more. But you see how my painting now has got like this gold shimmery quality to it? So I could like paint right over the top of that. That can be kind of neat. And we also have silver leaf or copper. We'll see which one comes out first. Looks like silver was next on top. So I'm going to peel back the little plastic coating. I'll grab a little bit with my paintbrush. And a lot of times you use like the static electricity of the paintbrush to pick up the flakes and move them around and to get them to go where you want. Now some people put them on flat and some people crinkle them up so they look antique. Has anybody ever been to St. John's or St. Ben's University? Ever been on that campus? They have that really big, beautiful church next to the lake on campus. That was built by a Bauhaus architect. So I'm going to go over on this drip just to show how sticky it is. In that church, they put gold on the ceiling because they want you to look up and be surrounded by like the warmth of heaven was the design. But when they put the gold on, the craftsmen were so perfectionist that it looked like a mirror, which was kind of cheesy. So the architect was trying to explain, and so there was a translation problem. And so he kicked everybody out, and he got up on the scaffolding with the wire brush, and he started scrubbing all the gold. And the monks who were commissioning the church, they walked in to see why all the workers were kicked out, and it was raining gold off the ceiling. So I don't know if you can imagine paying thousands of dollars to put gold on your ceiling of your church, and then your fancy architect is in there scrubbing like half of it off because it looks too precious. And then it's a really beautiful effect. So here's the silver. So you see how it catches light? I mean, it can really be dazzling to see this in a painting. So that's your gold leaf technique. I would maybe paint over that with some polymedium to seal it in. The rubber cement is in there. So those are kind of your 21 techniques that you need